In August 1945, as the suffocating smoke of war that had choked the Pacific for years finally began to dissipate, and as the entire world erupted in joyous celebration over the monumental victory against fascism, a legendary weapon that had once ruled the skies with absolute impunity, quietly met the cruel and abrupt end of its destiny. From the rudimentary dirt airstrips of the Philippines to the coral-paved runways of Okinawa, and deep within the sweltering malaria-ridden jungles of New Guinea and the Marianas, hundreds of Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter planes sit silently on shimmering tarmacs under the blinding tropical sun. These magnificent flying machines, possessing an unforgettable silhouette defined by their distinctive twin-boom-designed central cockpit nacelle and counter-rotating propellers, had been the most terrifying airborne instruments of war in the Pacific theater. America's absolute top aces, legendary figures like Richard Bong and Thomas McGuire, had piloted these very machines' aircraft, so lethal and imposing that the Germans respectfully and fearfully dubbed them the fork-tailed devil. To the Japanese adversaries looking up from the ground or across the perilous airspace, the Lightning's unique shape made it look terrifyingly like two airplanes sharing a single pilot. Yet, when the dawn of peace arrived with an unstoppable, sweeping momentum, what awaited these steely heroes of the sky was not a parade, but a chillingly uncertain and desolate future. To win this grueling, drawn-out war of attrition, the United States industrial machine had operated at a fever pitch, churning out these mechanical beasts by the thousands. By the time the production lines finally ground to a halt in August 1945, Lockheed and its vast network of subcontractors had delivered a staggering 10,037 Lightnings to the United States Army Air Forces. It stood as the only American fighter aircraft in continuous, uninterrupted production from the devastating morning of Pearl Harbor all the way to the unconditional surrender of Japan. But now the war was over. American military commanders found themselves staring down a tremendously thorny and immediate logistical nightmare. When victory renders your once invincible war machines practically useless overnight, what exactly do you do with tens of thousands of the most recognizable fighter planes the world has ever seen? The harsh sentence of fate was delivered with breathtaking speed. Within mere weeks of the Japanese surrender, the vast majority of the Lightning fleet faced a brutal, unforgiving reckoning. The reason was simple yet profound: a completely new era in aviation history. The jet age had quietly but definitively dawned. Lockheed's own revolutionary P-80 Shooting Star jet fighter had already entered intensive testing phases, signaling that the era of the propeller-driven air superiority fighter was drawing to a permanent and irreversible close. For the P-38, an iconic aircraft that had once represented the absolute cutting edge of aerial combat technology, obsolescence arrived with a savage and astonishing rapidity. The disposal of America's massive P-38 fleet commenced almost immediately, without a shred of sentimentality. Within the continental United States, this systemic destruction was pushed relentlessly through established bureaucratic channels. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation designated numerous storage and sales depots across the nation, with the Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona quickly becoming one of the primary hubs for this unprecedented metallurgical slaughterhouse. In the suffocating baking heat of the desert, rows upon rows of Lightnings set nose to tail like condemned prisoners awaiting execution, tightly packed alongside tens of thousands of other surplus aircraft waiting for the gavel to fall. The United States government began selling off these once astoundingly expensive wartime assets at prices that seem absurd, even heartbreaking to the modern observer. In these surplus boneyards, top-tier fighter planes were unceremoniously hawked as scrap metal. A majestic, fully armed P-38 Lightning could typically be purchased for a paltry sum of $1,200 to $1,250. Kingman Airfield alone, 37 Lightnings were sold at these absolute bargain basement prices to civilian buyers in early 1946. But these few aircraft that found new owners were the incredibly lucky exceptions. The overwhelming majority of the Lightnings were destined for a much darker fate. For the aircraft scattered across the vast expanses of the Pacific and other distant overseas theaters, the situation was far grimmer and profoundly bleak. The astronomical costs associated with shipping these massive twin-engine fighters back across the ocean to the United States made their repatriation economically unjustifiable. It was quite simply a losing financial proposition. Consequently, the chosen solution was as simple as it was brutal. Heavy rumbling bulldozers were brought onto the airfields mercilessly, shoving the once proud Lightnings into massive, twisted piles of scrap. Those historic airframes that had bravely flown through storms of flak over Reborn, the Solomon Islands, executing countless life-or-death combat sorties, were now literally crushed under steel tracks. Their valuable aluminum skins were roughly torn away, or in many cases the aircraft were simply about right in the depths of uninhabited jungles. From the remote strips of New Guinea to the Philippines, P-38s were left to rot exactly where they had landed after their final flights. The aggressive, dense tropical vegetation reached out like green tentacles, slowing them whole, while the humid salt-laden ocean breezes corroded their polished aluminum exteriors day after unrelenting day. Within just a few short years, the invincible warbirds that had once slashed through the Pacific skies at breathtaking speeds of 400 miles per hour were reduced to rusted mottled monuments, silently bearing witness to a brutal conflict that was already beginning to fade from the public's daily consciousness. Back on the American home front, the scenes of destruction were equally shocking and industrial in scale. The Wunderlich Contracting Company secured a massive $2.8 million contract, and their sole grim mandate was to reduce the mountainous piles of aircraft at Kingman Airfield into featureless generic aluminum ingots. Work crews toiled day and night, operating massive, high-temperature smelting furnaces. They took those proud airframes, machines that had crossed boundless oceans and engaged in desperate dogfights over multiple continents, and fed them directly into the roaring fires. This colossal scrapping operation generated tens of millions of pounds of recycled aluminum and steel, along with over 1 million gallons of salvaged aviation fuel, all of which was subsequently sold off for post-war industrial use. The pinnacle of aviation engineering, which had cost American taxpayers billions of dollars to design, test, and build, was ultimately incinerated into a fraction of its raw material value, vanishing into the greedy flames of the blast furnaces. By 1949, the very last Lightnings in the United States Air Force inventory were quietly retired, a mere for years after they had exhausted every ounce of their mechanical strength to help the Allies secure victory in the Pacific. However, not every Lightning suffered the indignity of the smelter. In the complex geopolitical chess match of the early Cold War, a handful of these fighters found unexpected new leases on life in foreign lands. Transferring surplus American warplanes to allied nations became crucial to early Cold War diplomacy. For countries desperately seeking to rebuild their national defense forces after years of brutal occupation or devastating conflict, America's overflowing surplus depots offered an affordable shortcut to military modernization. In 1948, representatives of the newly formed Republic of Korea approached American authorities with high hopes and a compelling proposal. At that time, roughly 100 pristine, virtually unused P-38 Lightning fighters were sitting quietly in storage facilities in the Philippines. These planes had never smelled the smoke of battle. Their engines gleamed as brightly as the day. They rolled off the assembly line. The South Koreans were equally eager to purchase this entire batch of advanced fighters to serve as the powerful core of their nascent air force. Yet this seemingly mutually beneficial request was coldly denied by the United States. American officials were harboring profound strategic anxieties. They feared that providing South Korea with such a high-performance, long-range strike aircraft might embolden them to launch a preemptive invasion of the North, a highly volatile scenario that Washington was desperate to avoid. Beyond these deep-seated political calculations, the P-38's notoriously complex twin-engine design required an exceptionally high level of specialized maintenance expertise, something the brand new South Korean crew simply did not possess. In stark contrast, the structurally simpler single-engine P-51 Mustang, despite being heavily worn from wartime use, was deemed far more practical for inexperienced mechanics. Ultimately, South Korea had to reluctantly accept a fleet of battered Mustangs and modified AT-6 Rainers as substitutes. Meanwhile, those pristine combat-ready Lightnings sitting in the Philippines warehouses planes that could have proudly defended a new nation ultimately could not escape the tragic fate of systematic scrapping. Despite the daunting complexity of maintaining them, the P-38 still managed to capture the attention of other nations scouring the globe for affordable battle-tested fighters. In April 1946, under a bilateral agreement, Italy received an allocation of 100 P-38 TEL fighters and DEF-5 reconnaissance variants. These aircraft were delivered to Italy at a sluggish pace of roughly one refurbished plane per month. They were assigned to the 3rd and 4th Stormo units, taking on daring reconnaissance flights over the tense Balkan Peninsula ground attack sorties, naval cooperation duties, and routine air superiority patrols. However, for the post-war Italian Air Force, this operational experience proved to be agonizingly costly and bathed in blood. The P-38 was a massive, incredibly complicated heavy fighter, and its operational logic was wildly different from the nimble, lightweight aircraft Italian pilots were accustomed to flying. To make matters substantially worse, the engines in these delivered planes were already old, having suffered severe wear and tear during intense wartime service. Couple this mechanical fatigue with a severe lack of specialized maintenance knowledge among local ground crews, and the recipe for disaster was complete. When pilots encountered sudden mid-air emergencies, human errors multiplied exponentially. Heartbreaking military records indicate that at least 30 P-38s crashed during their relatively brief tenure in Italian service, with many of these tragic accidents claiming the lives of the pilots. Despite exacting such a heavy toll, many Italian aviators secretly held a deep appreciation for the aircraft's exceptional ground visibility during takeoff and its rock-solid stability in flight. This rocky, blood-stained chapter of service lasted until 1956, when Italy's Lightnings were finally permanently grounded. Tragically driven by the lucrative post-war demand for high-value light alloys, not a single intact Italian P-38 airframe survived the scrap yards. Today, within the halls of the Italian Air Force Museum, only a solitary, disconnected cockpit and nose section remains, the sole melancholic relic of the nation's brief and brutal Lightning era. Halfway across the globe in Latin America, Honduras acquired 5 or 6 P-38s in September 1948. This sudden acquisition instantly elevated these aircraft to the status of the first high-performance fighters in Honduran history, forming the formidable backbone of their air power, alongside a fleet of Bell P-63 King Cobras. No one could have predicted that this small handful of Honduran Lightnings would go on to experience something that no other post-World War II P-38 anywhere in the world would ever see again: actual blood and gut serial combat. In 1957, during a fierce and escalating border dispute between Honduras and Nicaragua over the contested territory of Gracias a Dios province, 5 Honduran Air Force P-38s roared into the sky. They furiously bombed and strafed a village that had been occupied by advancing Nicaraguan military forces. Incredibly, this obscure border skirmish etched itself into history as the very last time this legendary World War II fighter would fire its guns in anger anywhere on the planet. The Honduran military deeply cherished these aging veterans, managing to keep their Lightning fleet operational well into the early 1960s, before finally replacing them with F-4U Corsairs. In a stroke of incredible luck, one of these Honduran P-38s was successfully transported back to the United States in 1960, ultimately becoming a highly prized crown jewel in the collection of the National Museum of the United States Air Force. Elsewhere, Cuba received 6 F-5 reconnaissance variants under the Rio Treaty in 1948, while the Dominican Republic acquired 2 unarmed twin-seat trainer Lightnings in 1940. 7 across the Pacific. China also managed to retain 15 of these aircraft. However, these small scattered fleets were entirely powerless against the relentless march of time. due to a severe lack of spare parts, fatal flying accidents, and general airframe exhaustion, they gradually vanished from the historical record, leaving barely a trace behind. Yet perhaps the most wildly dramatic and highly unusual post-war operation involving a Lightning took place in the dense jungles of Central America. In 1950, amidst the turbulent political chaos of Guatemala, a heavily modified P-38 night fighter painted entirely pitch black and stripped of all national insignia suddenly appeared like a phantom. It was operating in deep secrecy, collaborating with the CIA-backed Liberation Air Force on a highly classified covert mission. This black fork-tailed devil brazenly attacked the British cargo ship SS Springfjord, which was anchored peacefully in the port of San Jose. This shocking international incident was later meticulously detailed into classified Central Intelligence Agency files. This highly controversial Cold War proxy conflict provided a buzz, or espionage-laced final chapter to the combat career of a design originally conceived as a high-altitude interceptor. By the time the 1960s rolled around, finding an intact functional P-38 had become as difficult as finding a needle in a global haystack. The frenzied massive scrapping campaigns of the immediate post-war years, the tragic operational losses suffered, and for unservicing the simple creeping neglect of peacetime had ruthlessly whittled down this once sky-archening armada to a handful of scattered, lonely survivors. But the legend of the P-38 refused to be completely extinguished. A select few of these warbirds found an exhilarating second spring in the civilian world. The booming post-war air racing circuit provided a thrilling avenue of survival for these machines built for speed. From 1946 to 1949 at the world-famous Cleveland National Air Races, P-38s painted in blindingly bright flamboyant colors engaged in hearts, topping fiercely competitive duels. Their unique twin boom silhouettes, accompanied by the deafening chest-rattling roar of their massive engines, screamed around the high racing pylons, captivating thousands of spectators desperate for peacetime visual spectacles. Lockheed's own legendary test pilot, Tony LeVere, leveraging his intimate, unparalleled knowledge of the aircraft, purchased a P-38J, painted it a highly conspicuous glossy fire engine reddened, became a massive star in the sky as a professional air racer and stunt pilot. In their obsessive quest for maximum low-altitude speed, other maniacal pilots subjected their Lightnings to radical extreme modifications. They ruthlessly stripped away or completely redesigned the complex turbocargo systems and intercoolers, installing heavily streamlined air intakes to shave off every possible ounce of aerodynamic drag. During the 1947 Ohio Trophy race, pilot Charles Walding flew his heavily mutated Lightning to a staggering second place, finish clocking in at an eye-watering speed of 351 miles per hour. In that era, these roaring modified Lightnings tearing up the racecourse represented the absolute fastest, most awe-inspiring propeller-driven aircraft that the average American civilian could ever hope to witness up close. Unfortunately, the good times did not last. The racing circuit proved to be only a temporary reprieve from the scrapyard. During the 1949 Cleveland races, a horrifically violent and fatal crash occurred. Although this specific tragedy did not involve a P-38, the massive public outcry and sweeping safety concerns it triggered led to an immediate total ban on this type of closed-core spylon racing. Stripped of their stage, the racing Lightnings became nomads, once again scattered among wealthy private owners. A fortunate few of these speed demons eventually navigated their way into the quiet halls of aviation museums, preserved as static monuments to a bygone era of aviation glory. Beyond the adrenaline-fueled world of racing, the highly specialized Def-5 photo reconnaissance variant discovered a far more practical, expansive, and lucrative niche in the commercial sector. During the brutal years of the war, approximately 1,200 Lightnings had been purpose-built or field-modified into unarmed flying camera platforms. Space in the nose that usually housed a lethal concentration of machine guns was hollowed out, replaced by up to 5 incredibly sophisticated high-resolution aerial cameras. The F-5 had served valiantly as the primary long-range photo reconnaissance platform in the European theater. Veteran intelligence officers proudly claimed that these planes provided the vast majority of all American aerial photographic intelligence in that conflict. When peace broke out, sharp-minded civilian mapping companies immediately grasped the immense commercial potential locked within these airframes. The Cargill Aerial Surveys Company of Midland, Texas moved with lightning speed, purchasing surplus F-5s from the War Assets Administration for incredibly low prices, spending a mere $1,250 per airframe. Soon outfits like Aero Exploration Company of Tulsa, WWII on Aerial Surveys of California, Ark Aerial Mapping, and even Spartan Air Services up in Canada were extensively operating these Lightning reconnaissance variants throughout the entire decade of the 1950s. These tireless machines soared high above the vast untamed and remote wildernesses of North and South America. Their inherently massive fuel capacity and unparalleled high-altitude performance made them seem custom-built for the grueling demands of aerial cartography. In 1956, an F-5 belonging to WWII embarked on a truly extraordinary mission, flying all the way to Ecuador in South America on behalf of the United States Department of the Interior. Its task was to photograph towering snow-capped active volcanoes so that scientists could accurately measure the alarming retreat of glaciers over the preceding decade. Eyewitnesses on the ground fondly and excitedly recalled how the highly skilled pilots, upon completing their tedious hours-long mapping runs, would blow off steam by performing a dizzying array of barrel rolls and extreme aerobatics directly over the Quito airport. For many local observers staring up in wonder, it was the first and only time they would ever lay eyes on the graceful, deadly lines of the legendary twin-boom fighter. Among these civilian workhorses, there is one record of service that simply defies belief. An F-5 sold for that rock-bottom price of $1,250 in 1946 was flown incredibly hard by Cargill Aerial Surveys until 1952, and then was sold to Mark Aerial Mapping, where it continued to reliably earn its keep until 1963. Over 15 years of relentless commercial flying had extracted every single drop of value from its aging airframe. By the time it finally landed for good, these once cutting-edge, highly complex twin-engine fighters were viewed by the modern public as exotic, temperamental antiques. Their golden age of economic viability had vanished like the morning dew. Newer, more capable, and vastly more efficient jet and turbo-prop platforms had sprung up everywhere. The surviving mapping Lightnings that had mapped continents were quietly pushed to the back of lonely hangars. Only a very precious few were ever meticulously restored, while the rest were tragically left exposed to the elements, rotting away in the unforgiving weather. As the decades rolled on into the late 20th century, a profound shift occurred. When the practical combat and commercial value of the P-38 plummeted to absolute zero, its priceless value as a historical artifact, a tangible witness to history, began to skyrocket. Aviation museums worldwide launched desperate, wide-ranging efforts to locate and acquire these incredibly rare exhibits. The Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson took extreme care to preserve the few aircraft of profound historical significance they possessed. Simultaneously, deeply passionate, wealth-funded private collectors began mounting expeditions to the most remote, inhospitable corners of the globe, hunting for airframes that had been swallowed by time. From the suffocating, sweltering, snake-infested jungles of New Guinea, dozens of Lightning wrecks that had crash-landed in desperate combat or been reluctantly abandoned were discovered. Fanatical recovery teams operating with the precision and patience of archaeologists painstakingly excavated these heavily corroded, twisted skeletons, seeing the potential for resurrection where others saw only junk. In the freezing, unforgiving wilderness of Alaska, aircraft that had tragically lost their way and crashed during wartime ferry flights were brought back to the surface after decades of absolute isolation. In this modern era, every single aircraft retransformed into an epic, perilous adventure, and every subsequent restoration was destined to become a massively expensive multi-year undertaking that required hand-fabricating countless, obsolete parts from scratch. Yet among all these legendary tales of lost warbirds, the most spectacular, breathtaking recovery operation of them all began in 1980 when explorers but Epps and Richard Taylor gambled a massive fortune to secure salvage rights in Greenland. Their seemingly impossible goal was to locate an entire lost squadron of aircraft that had vanished into the endless white expanse back in 1940. To historical logs confirmed that on the desperate day of July 15, 1940, to exactly 6 P-38 Lightnings and to massive B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, attempting a hazardous transatlantic ferry flight to support the war effort in Britain encountered terrifying severe weather conditions. They were forced to make emergency belly landings on the desolate, uninhabited ice cap. Miraculously, every single crew member was eventually rescued, but the priceless aircraft had to be abandoned to the mercy of the freezing Arctic winds. Epps and Taylor initially operated under the highly optimistic assumption that after merely a few decades these planes would be covered by a relatively thin layer of snow. They even fantasized that the iconic twin tails might still be visibly poking out of the ice. They could not have been more wrong. The awesome, relentless power of nature far exceeded their wildest calculations. Decades of massive glacial movement had violently shifted these multi-ton aircraft a full 2 miles from their original crash coordinates. Even more despairing, they were entombed beneath a staggering 268 feet of densely packed, rock-hard solid ice. Operating in this deadly environment, simply pinpointing their exact location required years of agonizing freezing searches and the deployment of cutting-edge ground-penetrating radar technology. Finally, Royce Offner, a wealthy and determined businessman from Kentucky, generously stepped into bankroll the ultimate history-making recovery expedition. Confronted by impenetrable ice, the brilliant engineering crew invented a totally unique custom-built device they affectionately dubbed the Super Gopher. This contraption worked by circulating boiling hot water through a massive copper cone, literally melting a deep, perfectly vertical shaft straight down through the glacier. The excavation process was agonizingly slow and incredibly dangerous. Every time a worker descended through the claustrophobic shaft to reach the buried aircraft, the dark, freezing journey took a full 25 minutes. Armed with high-pressure steam hoses, the courageous crew operated like surgeons performing microsurgery inside a freezer, painstakingly carving out a massive cavern of ice around the sleeping fighter plane. All the while, heavy-duty industrial pumps had to run flawlessly and continuously to extract the massive volumes of meltwater, lest the icy tomb collapse and crush them all. This mind-boggling defiance of human limits took 3 full months of freezing labor. Finally, on the incredibly emotional day of August 1st, 1990, to the final and most critical piece of the P-38 emerged from the icy prison that had held it for half a century. It was the massive center section of the aircraft, measuring 17 feet across and weighing an astonishing 3 tons, slowly dragged to the surface through a shaft the crew had spent weeks desperately widening. This miraculous survivor of the ice cap was deeply and affectionately christened Glacier Girl. She was carefully transported back to Mid-Lobsokaki, where an excruciatingly patient 10-year saga of restoration officially commenced. Dedicated to supreme historical accuracy, the engineers poured their souls into the project, and remarkably, they managed to salvage and reuse approximately 80% of the aircraft's original wartime components in the total rebuild. After a decade of grinding effort, the magical moment arrived on October 26, 2002, under the breathless, tearful gaze of an estimated 20,000 fanatical aviation enthusiasts and veterans. Glacier Girl's twin Allison engines roared to deafening life. She taxied proudly down the runway, her very first attempt at flight, after slumbering in the ice for 60 long years. As this legendary fighter plane, looking as flawlessly pristine as the day she left the Lockheed factory floor, elegantly lifted her nose and soared triumphantly into the deep blue Kentucky sky, more than one white-haired World War II veteran in the crowd wept openly. After 60 years of silent, frozen sleep, in the Leith a Arctic cold, her mission to fly was finally gloriously reborn in the skies of the 21st century. Incredibly, other forgotten lightnings also began to see the light of day, returning from equally impossible circumstances. In 2007, the relentless shifting of ocean currents and tidal forces suddenly and unexpectedly swept away the sands on a beach in Wales, revealing the battered, corroded remains of the Maid of Harlech. This was a P-38 that had made a desperate emergency landing on that very beach back in 1940 due to severe mechanical failures. Pilot's second Lieutenant Robert Elliott had walked away without a scratch. However, constrained by the technology of the time, the U.S. Army Air Forces found it absolutely impossible to launch the heavy grounded fighter off the soft sinking sand. To prevent the cutting-edge weaponry from falling into enemy hands, they rapidly stripped the nose of its vital machine guns and cannons and reluctantly abandoned the airframe to the tides. For the next 65 years, the aircraft vanished, completely swallowed by the shifting, secretive sands of nature. In a heartbreaking historical twist, less than 3 months after surviving that beach landing, Lieutenant Elliott himself was shot down and killed in a ferocious dogfight over the skies of Tunisia. To this very day, neither his remains nor the aircraft he was flying on that fatal day have ever been recovered. The sudden reappearance of the Maid of Harlech felt like a heavy, mournful sigh from history itself. Meanwhile, from the distant southern hemisphere, in Papua New Guinea, multiple lightnings, their skins peppered with historical bullet holes, have been painstakingly extracted from treacherous, deeply unforgiving jungle crash sites. Organizations like the Historical Aircraft Restoration Society braved impossible odds to recover the famous White 33 from the treacherous muddy swamps near Finn Ch Hafen. After suffering a collapsed nose gear during a rough landing in early 1940, Ford had sat helpless in that cursed jungle until its discovery. Orchestrating a jungle recovery of this magnitude is akin to a massive military logistics operation. It requires chartering heavy-lift helicopters, hiring armies of local labor to hack roads through virgin rainforest, and years of exhaustive, meticulous planning. But it is exactly this kind of relentless, unyielding dedication that continues to pull these steel treasures, once thought lost to humanity, forever out from the abyss of total obscurity. Fast forward to the present day, thanks to the tireless, decades-long devotion of aviation preservationists around the entire globe. Roughly 24 P-38s have survived the gauntlet of time to sit proudly in museums and hangars worldwide. Even more miraculously, about 10 of these incredibly complex machines are maintained in pristine mechanical condition, completely airworthy and ready to touch the clouds. Of course, these microscopic numbers are never static. They fluctuate dynamically as new exhausting restoration projects are finally completed, or when tragically rare flight accidents occur. These priceless artifacts of human aviation history are currently housed in the most prestigious facilities on Earth, places like the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Ohio, the world-renowned Planes of Fame Air Museum in Chino, California, and tucked away in the heavily guarded hangars of ultra-wealthy private collectors. It must be heavily emphasized that every single Lightning capable of flight today represents a staggering, almost incomprehensible investment of wealth, time, and human energy. Merely maintaining these 80-year-old, fiercely complicated twin-engine beasts demands specialized traditional mechanical expertise that has all but vanished from the face of the Earth. The beating hearts of these planes, their engines must be meticulously, painstakingly rebuilt by hand using archaic, old technologies. Thousands of microscopic precision parts that have not been manufactured for over half a century must be reverse-engineered from fragile, yellowing blueprints and machined from scratch, or scavenged at exorbitant cost from the shattered remains of crashed aircraft across the globe. For the wealthy private individuals who own them, simply securing the insurance policies required to get these irreplaceable antiques off the runway can easily cost hundreds of thousands of dollars every single year. Yet despite facing these monumental, almost crushing economic and technical barriers, the surviving Lightnings stubbornly and proudly continue to fly at the 21st century. Their unmistakable, totally unique twin-boom silhouettes make highly emotional, show-stopping appearances at massive air shows and reverent heritage flights across the United States. Organizations driven by pure historical passion, such as the Commemorative Air Force, spare absolutely no expense to operate these flawlessly restored examples. Their singular mission is to preserve for generations yet unborn the visceral roaring memory of the steel eagles that once darkened the skies over the Pacific in their thousands. And that miraculous aircraft dragged from the crushing depths of the Greenland, ice-capped Glacier Girl went on to achieve something truly spectacular. After her rebirth, she proudly flew all the way across the vast Atlantic Ocean flawlessly, completing the exact transatlantic ferry mission that a brutal snowstorm had interrupted 60 years prior. Looking back at the grand tapestry of history, the entire post-World War saga of the P-38 Lightning is ultimately a profoundly dramatic, sweeping epic. It is the story of an absolute pinnacle of wartime technology that was ruthlessly and rapidly discarded, only to be slowly, painstakingly redeemed by the long arc of history. Within a mere 4 years of securing that monumental global victory, in 1945, this staggering armada of over 10,000 aircraft was almost entirely wiped from existence. This erasure was the result of massive, hasty governments crapping directives, tragic operational losses, while serving in ill-equipped for air forces, and the simple careless neglect of a peacetime society eager to embrace the future. At that moment, the thunderous jet-propelled future had arrived with an unstoppable, crushing momentum. Regardless of how radically innovative or avant-garde the P-38's design had been, the era of the propeller-driven fighter had been mercilessly relegated to the dust bin of the past. However, the handful of Lightnings that are so fiercely treasured today, despite representing only a microscopic fractional percentage of the massive thousands originally built, have transcended their original purpose. They are no longer just cold, industrial machines of aluminum and steel. They serve as a tangible physical bridge connecting our modern world to a visceral past. They allow us to reach out and touch an era defined by smoke, fire, and unimaginable sacrifice. In that fading era, countless vibrant, courageous young men climbed into the cramped, freezing cockpits of these very machines the enemy cursed as fork-tailed devils, and flew without hesitation toward distant, brutal, and tragic horizons that their parents living in peacetime could scarcely even begin to comprehend. These few surviving P-38s, bearing the invisible scars of time on their polished airframes, have indisputably earned their exalted, permanent place in the grand narrative of human history. They stand before us today not only as the ultimate triumphant survivors of a global war that engulfed the planet in flames, but also as the most resilient, magnificent survivors of the blind, systematic wave of industrial destruction that followed in its wake. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's deadliest miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe. I am your strategy observer. I will see you on the next battlefield.